Michael Perry was executed tonight for the 2001 murder of Sandra Stotler.
Have you ever wondered what goes through the mind of a killer in the final hours before death? On July 1st, 2010, Michael James Perry woke up in a prison cell, knowing this would be the last sunrise he would ever see. But there was one unexpected visitor that afternoon, someone who would change everything. He was just 19 when he committed a brutal triple murder in a quiet Texas suburb. He was a young man who once laughed during his trial, and a death row inmate who, until his final breath, insisted on his innocence. Little did he know that by midnight, his final appeal would collapse, and a chilling silence would fall over the prison. So what did he do in those last 24 hours? What words did he speak? And in the end, did he show even a flicker of remorse? This is the final 24 hours of Michael James Perry. Before he was a convicted murderer on death row, Michael James Perry was just a boy growing up in Texas, a boy whose early years were shaped by instability, trauma, and spiraling behavior. Born in 1982, Perry's life began under the heavy weight of dysfunction. His biological parents gave him up for adoption when he was still an infant. He was taken in by Carlton and Sandra Perry, a suburban couple who tried to provide him with a loving and structured home. As a child, Michael was restless. He had trouble sitting still. He didn't follow rules, and his temper could flip like a switch. At school, teachers noticed how easily he got distracted, how quickly frustration turned into outbursts. Over time, those outbursts became more frequent, more intense. His parents tried everything: therapy, medication, special schools. They sent him to treatment centers, hoping someone could help. But nothing seemed to change him. At home, he became more distant. At school, more aggressive. By the time Michael was in his teens, the trouble had moved beyond the walls of his house. He started stealing. He used drugs. He ran away. His first arrest came before his 17th birthday. It wasn't for something big, a stolen truck, but it was only the beginning. He bounced between juvenile detention centers and short-term jail time. His rap sheet grew longer and his behavior got worse. Each time he got out, he seemed less connected to the world, like he had already checked out of anything normal. Michael Perry was still young, but he had already stopped caring. He drifted from place to place, cut ties with old friends, and pushed away the parents who still tried to save him. Then, not long after he turned 19, everything changed. In late October of 2001, Michael James Perry and his friend Jason Burkett were desperate. They wanted fast money, drugs, a way to escape whatever mess they had created for themselves. And they believed they had found an easy target, a woman who had once shown Michael kindness. Her name was Christine Lutz. Christine lived in a quiet, well-kept home in the Woodlands, Texas. She was a mother in her 50s, known for her warmth and generosity. She had previously taken Michael in when he needed help. She gave him meals, a bed, treated him like one of her own. But in Perry's mind, that generosity no longer mattered. Christine had something he wanted, a red Camaro sitting in the driveway. Michael and Jason decided they would steal it. On October 24th, the pair showed up at Christine's home under the pretense of a visit. What happened next was anything but friendly. Christine refused to hand over her car keys. She stood her ground, and for that, Michael Perry shot her. The details are cold and devastating. She was killed in her own home by someone she had once tried to help. The man she fed, sheltered, and trusted. But the horror didn't end there. Later that night, Michael and Jason lured Christine's son, Adam Lutz, 20 years old, and his friend Jeremy Richardson to a remote area nearby. There was no confrontation, no argument, just a cold-blooded ambush. Both young men were shot and killed, their bodies dumped like trash, stripped of life for no reason other than being in the way. In a matter of hours, 3 innocent lives were wiped out: a mother, a son, a friend. The crimes were brutal and shocking, but what made them even more disturbing was the lack of remorse. There was no sign of hesitation, no second thoughts, just a trail of bodies and a red Camaro taken as if that was all that mattered. For a community like the Woodlands, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a nightmare. A place that once felt safe was now the scene of a triple homicide, and no one could understand why. Why did Perry do it? What snapped inside him? At that point, no one had the answers, but justice was already coming. Michael Perry didn't get far. Only days after the murders, police found the red Camaro. It was a critical mistake. Perry and Burkett had been spotted driving the stolen car, and security footage placed them at local stores using Christine Lutz's credit cards. When officers finally caught up to Michael, he laughed. Not the nervous kind of laugh. It was unsettling, cold, almost like the weight of what happened hadn't hit him at all. But soon, the reality set in. He was charged with capital murder, and this time, there was no escaping the consequences. Jason Burkett was arrested too. Though his involvement was slightly different, the prosecution believed both young men played key roles in the killings. What followed was a trial that shocked everyone. Michael was just 19 years old, young, pale-faced, with a buzzed haircut and boyish features. He didn't look like a murderer, but as the evidence came in, photos from the crime scenes, witness testimony, ballistics, one truth became undeniable. Perry had pulled the trigger. Even worse, Perry's behavior in the courtroom stunned the victims' families. At times, he smiled. He smirked, and during one particularly chilling moment, he laughed, not once, not twice, several times. It was a cruelty that reopened wounds. Prosecutors pushed hard for the death penalty, and when the verdict was read, Michael Perry showed no reaction. When the sentence was announced, death by lethal injection, he looked down, quiet, but he never apologized, not once during trial. Jason Burkett, meanwhile, received life in prison. His father, serving time in the same prison, pleaded for mercy on his son's behalf. The jury gave it to him. Michael wasn't as lucky. After the trial ended, the noise stopped. The cameras were gone. The voices of lawyers, judges, and jurors faded, and what was left was silence. Perry was sent to the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, where Texas houses its male death row inmates. His world shrank to a concrete cell, roughly 6 feet wide and 10 feet long, a narrow bed, a sink, a stainless steel toilet, a small slot in the door where his meals were passed through. No windows, no sunshine, just fluorescent lights and steel bars. He was 20 years old when he entered death row. Still young, but day after day, the years stacked up. 21, 25, then 28. He wasn't allowed physical contact with visitors. Conversations with family or legal counsel happened through glass. Most days, there were none. Letters came, sometimes from strangers, supporters, critics, people who believed he was guilty, people who believed he wasn't. Sometimes he responded, sometimes he didn't. The concrete walls didn't care. He spent 23 hours a day in isolation, 1 hour for recreation, alone in a small fenced yard, under the open sky, but always under watch. Time became slippery, a blur of days and nights with no distinction, just the humming buzz of overhead lights and the occasional footsteps of a guard walking the tier. He appealed his sentence over and over. His lawyers argued questions about mental illness, about childhood trauma, about possible misconduct. But each year, those appeals were denied, one by one, like a door closing behind him. Michael sat in his cell, waiting. He began to write about faith, about God. Some believed he had changed. Others saw it as a performance. He spoke to filmmakers. He agreed to be featured in a documentary, Into the Abyss, by Werner Herzog. In it, Perry denied his guilt, repeatedly, calmly, almost serenely. But outside those prison walls, the families of the victims still lived with their loss. No faith, no words. Nothing could bring back Sandra, Adam, or Jeremy. The years dragged on, but the date eventually came. July 1st, 2010. After 7 years on death row, the clock had finally run out, and on that morning, he would open his eyes for the very last time. At exactly 5 a.m., Michael James Perry awoke inside his holding cell, just a few steps away from the execution chamber at the Walls unit in Huntsville. Unlike his years spent in the Polunsky unit, this cell was different, closer, quieter, final. There was no alarm clock, no sunrise pouring in through the bars, just the rustling of guards and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Perry didn't move much at first. He lay there staring at the ceiling. He had told people before that he wasn't afraid to die, that he knew where he was going. But even if he believed in salvation, he also knew the weight of the hours ahead. This was his last morning on Earth. By 6 a.m., Perry was offered breakfast. It was a standard tray, scrambled eggs, toast, oatmeal, and a carton of milk. He accepted it quietly. Not out of hunger, but more out of routine. He picked at the eggs, sipped the milk. There was no appetite, just something to do with his hands. By 6:30, he had received a visit from a prison chaplain. The man asked him if he wanted to pray. Perry nodded quietly. Their conversation wasn't long. There was no crying, no dramatic breakdowns, but there was heaviness in the room, like the air had thickened. When the chaplain left, Perry sat alone on the small metal bed, hands clasped, waiting. Every sound was louder than usual. The footsteps of guards, the clink of metal trays, the occasional distant echo of a voice down the hall. They were all reminders that time was moving forward. He was given the option to shower. He accepted. In those moments he moved slowly, washing his body as if it were no longer his, as if it were already slipping away. No one rushed him, but no one lingered either. Every part of the process was quiet, clinical, efficient. By 8 a.m., he was back in his cell, dressed in clean clothes, not a prison jumpsuit, but state-issued clothes for the condemned, a simple white shirt and pants. Perry asked for writing materials. He had a few last things to say, letters to scribble, thoughts to put down. He wrote for a long time. A guard observed, but didn't interrupt. No one knew what was in those final pages. At one point before 10 a.m., he requested to speak to one of his spiritual supporters. It was a brief exchange. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't confess. But there was a quietness in his voice, a kind of forced calm that sounded more like surrender than peace. By 11 a.m., his first meal of the day was offered, but Perry declined to eat. He said he wasn't hungry. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe it was something deeper. He sat back down on the cot, folded his hands again. Time crawled forward, minute by minute. No visitors came, no final words spoken aloud. And in that quiet space, the countdown continued. By 12 p.m., the July heat pressed against the prison walls in Huntsville, Texas. Inside, the air felt still, tense but quiet. In a small holding cell near the execution chamber, Michael James Perry sat alone. No television, no radio, no conversation, just the ticking of a clock that no longer offered comfort, only countdown. At 12:30, the door opened with a soft rattle. It was his mother. She had arrived quietly, without media or attention. For the first time that day, Perry showed a flicker of emotion. His eyes welled. His shoulders shifted as though carrying something too heavy to be seen by the guards. She was allowed a short visit under supervision. What they said in those moments remains private, but observers noted Perry didn't try to defend himself or claim innocence. He listened. He nodded. There were tears. She held his hand through the glass for as long as she was allowed. By 1 p.m., she was escorted out, her face drawn, her steps slow. Perry didn't watch her go. He stared at the floor after the door shut, unmoving for nearly 10 minutes. At 1:30, he was escorted for a short walk in the recreation yard, just a narrow stretch of concrete surrounded by fencing and shadow. He walked slowly, head down, his hands cuffed lightly in front of him. There were no last words whispered to the guards, no attempt at conversation. He simply moved in a slow loop until he was guided back inside. At 2 p.m., he returned to his holding cell. Around this time, the medical team began quiet preparation for the standard protocol, a final health check to ensure there were no physical issues that would interfere with the execution. Blood pressure, pulse, pupil response, a quick but thorough routine. Perry sat still, quiet through it all, answering the occasional question with a flat yes or no. There were no complaints, no medical concerns. Physically, he was healthy enough to die. By 3 p.m., preparations for witnesses began elsewhere in the prison. The press, victims' relatives, and select state officials were being screened and processed for entry. Perry, though not told of each step, could feel the shift. The pace outside his cell grew more deliberate, the weight of the moment more present. At 3:30 p.m., Perry was brought his final meal, his last request. He had asked for a heavy, specific spread, 3 bacon, egg, and cheese omelets, 3 chicken cheese enchiladas, and 3 sodas, 1 each of Pepsi, Coke, and Dr. Pepper. The tray was placed before him in silence. He looked it over and nodded once. There was no rush in how he ate, no signs of nerves. He worked his way through the food slowly, chewing methodically, pausing occasionally, as if letting each bite settle more in memory than in his stomach. He didn't finish everything. Few ever do, but he ate enough to mark the ritual, a moment of final control in a day otherwise stripped of choice. By 4, the tray was removed. Perry wiped his hands and sat back, staring blankly ahead. The walls didn't move. The shadows didn't shift. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent. Inside, time was nearly up. By 4:30 p.m., the low hum of final preparations echoed quietly through Huntsville unit. Now, with the final hour closing in, it was time. A small team of guards arrived at the cell. Their tone was calm, rehearsed. They instructed Perry to stand. He complied without resistance. He wore a clean white prison uniform, standard issue, pressed and plain. On his feet, soft white slip-on shoes. There were no shackles as he was escorted. The corridor between the holding cell and the execution chamber was just a few short steps, but it felt like the longest walk of his life. By 5:40 p.m., the final preparations were underway inside the Huntsville unit. Michael James Perry was moved from the holding cell to the execution chamber. His last appeals had already failed. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected a final petition just 90 minutes earlier. It was over. Inside the sterile pale green room, Perry was guided to the gurney. He wore a simple white uniform, barefoot, his face pale but composed. He climbed onto the padded table without resistance. As officers gently strapped him down, chest, arms, legs, a hush fell across both sides of the glass wall. Behind it, 2 separate groups stood silent, Perry's mother, an aunt, and close friends on one side. On the other, family members of Sandra Stutler, the woman he had brutally murdered almost 9 years earlier. 4 lines were inserted into both arms. The needlework was routine, the procedure clinical, but the room was charged with emotion. A photo of Sandra was visible in the hands of her daughter, Lisa Balloon, who had come to witness the moment justice would be served. At 6 p.m., the warden asked Perry if he had any final words. He spoke with emotion, his voice trembling. "I want to start off by saying I want everyone to know what's involved in this atrocity, that they are forgiven by me," he said, nearly choking on his own sobs. "Mom, I love you. I'm coming home, Dad. I'm coming home." The moment cracked the room. From behind the glass, his mother wept silently, pressing a tissue to her face. His aunt lowered her head. A single tear rolled down Perry's right cheek. Then the drugs began to flow. First, the sedative entered his veins. His eyes fluttered, his chest rose and fell. Then he hiccuped. Once, twice, 4 times. A sharp gasp. Then stillness. That solitary tear glistened as Perry's face faded to gray. His body lay unmoving, lips slack, expression almost peaceful. A quiet sob escaped his mother. One of the witnesses from the victim's side turned away. Some of them whispered, gasped quietly, not from pity but from the gravity of finality. At 6:17 p.m., the attending physician emerged from behind a curtain. He checked the IV lines, lifted Perry's eyelids, pressed a stethoscope to his chest, then gave a small nod. Michael James Perry was dead. He was the 14th person executed in Texas that year. Outside, reporters filed statements, but the rawest reaction came from Lisa Ballone, Sandra Stotler's daughter. "Going in, I thought it would be worse," she said, "and I felt sorry for the family. It is not a good day for anybody. When he said he forgave us, I knew justice had been served." She paused, then added, "I needed to see if he was the monster I built him up to be. Apparently he is." By the time the sun had fully set over Huntsville, Texas, Michael James Perry's body had already been removed from the chamber. No vigil, no crowds, no chants, just a cooling gurney, a vacant holding cell, and a signed death certificate. Outside the prison gates, the press reported the execution as a footnote, one of over 200 carried out at the Huntsville unit since reinstatement. But for two families, the weight of that moment would linger long after the headlines disappeared. Perry's mother left the prison in silence. Her son had asked for forgiveness. He'd cried for her. But that didn't undo what had been done. She'd spent nearly a decade loving a child the world had labeled a monster. Now she'd spend the rest of her life carrying the memory of a tearful goodbye no mother should ever endure. 3 people died in the Woodlands, Texas in 2001. One more died in Huntsville in 2010. And a long chain of pain and grief was set in motion the moment Perry pulled that trigger. There were no winners, only survivors and silence. As always, the truth may lie somewhere in the silence. Thank you for watching the final 24 hours of Michael James Perry. If this story moved you, consider sharing it. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply researched true crime documentaries.